My name is Sarah Ruiz. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the ASHRAE Foundation. We are piloting this exciting photo ID project in St. Charles, which is why you're here. So if all of a sudden you're like, wait, what? Photo ID, St. Charles, now would be a good time to sign off because that is what we're going to talk about today. So if you are ready to talk about photo identification and what you can do about that in St. Charles, then you're in the right place. Let me pull up my slides here. And if I could get a thumbs up or something, or come off mute, let me know you can see it. That would be great. Great, thumbs up. I love it. Thank you. So today we're going to go through a couple of things. So I'll talk to you about the ASHRAE Foundation so you know who we are and why we're doing this. Give you a little context around what this whole issue around photo IDs is about. We'll go a little bit more into some details about Missouri specifically. This is not a Missouri specific issue, but it looks a specific kind of way in Missouri. So we'll kind of dance around both of those for a little bit. Then we're going to talk about what the North City Photo ID Project is. That's the program that we run currently in North St. Louis City. And then we will get into what it will look like in St. Charles and what the specific pieces of work that volunteers do during the clinic days are. So I will flood you with information. And I'm going to try to say it a few more times, but I'm going to say it now. The goal of today is not for you to remember everything. You don't need to take furious notes, although if you like to do that as I do, please feel free. But everything that we're going to talk about that you would need as a volunteer is in a volunteer binder that you'll use, that we'll have throughout the clinic spaces. So this is more of a sponge mode than like a remember these facts so that you can get tested on it. So if you can take a deep breath and let yourself be flooded with information, write down your questions, your comments, your cuss words if you feel so desired, so that we can sort of get into it together and pick it apart as we go. But I definitely see this as like a learning. So this is one piece in all of the ongoing work that you're doing. So to get us started, the ASHRAE Foundation was founded by Rabbi Susan. Oh, sorry, let me pull up the chat here. I don't want to miss things here. Great. I love binders too. ASHRAE, also feel free at any time, put something in the chat, flail, whatever, introduce me or interrupt me so that I can answer your questions as we go, or I'll let you know that I'm about to answer it. But feel free to come off and talk, or to put something in the chat, and I'll try and stay on top of that. So ASHRAE was founded in 2022 by Rabbi Susan Talvey. We really started our operational existence in the spring of 2022. And by the fall of 2022, we had launched our photo ID project. This really came about in sort of a, what do you call that? Like a serendipitous way of like being in different places at different times and having all sorts of things intersect. As you might know, the Missouri House Legislature passed House Bill 1878 in 2022. So IDs were like a big deal, but we weren't created as an organization to do IDs. It just became the first issue space that we were able to show up in. We run a series of core and responsive programming. So our core programming is certainly now about photo identification, assistance, and access. And we also, I'm a big believer, intentional investment in coalitions and collaboration. So I think there are some other efforts that we're doing to intentionally invest in coalition spaces, in nonprofit sort of ecosystems in St. Louis more broadly. And then we also work to enrich public discourse to advance equity. So that has looked like our Foundations of Justice series. We'll have another one. We had one about gun violence last fall. We had one planned for this spring, but we have bumped it given the nature of things this year so far. So that will be happening with Dr. Austin Coker in October of this year about immigration. So outside of the core programming and responsive programming areas, we're thinking and doing work in gun violence, ending poverty and homelessness, and resistance and support for immigrant families. So happy to talk to you all about those things, but today we're going to zoom in on that sort of flagship work, which is our photo ID program. So to get started, I'd like to present you with a question. If you would come off mute or put it in chat, when was the last time you used a photo ID? Take a minute and think about it. When did you last use it? Flying, great.
When I voted.
When you voted?
I wasn't happy about it, but I used it because I had to.
Who else? Voting, great. Jan?
Yep, voting.
My dad had surgery recently and I picked up medicine for him. I don't know if anyone has done that. Or also, I'm sure my dad, not to just out my dad, but I'm sure he used his photo ID when he got to the hospital for that. So there are lots of reasons, as you all know, that people need a photo ID, right? So we talked about voting, we talked about medicine, healthcare, also lots of the emergency services that you need to access, like emergency food, emergency shelter. Even our work recently with the Red Cross following the tornadoes was enlightening to learn about, again, the ways that IDs become a barrier to accessing so much more. But you also need it for things like housing, right? You can't sign a lease or certainly can't buy a house without an ID. But you also can't get into a lot of the recovery programs or transitional housing programs without an ID. You also have to have ID to go to school, to get an education, to get a job. Thanks 1986 Immigration Reform Act, you need an ID to get a job, specific kinds of IDs. You need an ID to access financial services, banking services, cash checks, send money, transfer money, receive money, all of those things, right? So an ID, I think, became this sort of has become this hidden key to opening all sorts of spaces. And for ASHRAE, we think about interrupting cycles of poverty as sort of one of the core principles of how we enter into the work. And so having an ID is really critical for accessing all of the resources and services and tools available that can in turn interrupt these vicious cycles of poverty, right? And I think the flip side is also true. When you can't access that, then those cycles are strengthened and perpetuated, right? So it sort of feeds off of itself. So in addition to sort of anecdotally telling you this, we're part of the Missouri State ID Access Coalition, which I'll tell you a little bit about more later today. But we have done a survey of people that attended or received services at an ID program like ours across the state. And these are, again, mirroring what we just discussed, but the primary reasons that Missourians who need ID assistance say that they need the ID, right? Employment, top of the list, right? You can't get a job unless you have an ID. Follow quickly behind that, housing and public benefits. We didn't mention that on the previous slide, but enrolling in SNAP or food stamps or the other kinds of benefits and services like that also requires an ID. I worked with a woman recently who was at risk of losing her Section 8 housing voucher verification status because her ID had expired and she's disabled and can't get to the ID office to renew it. And so it was like, this whole thing, and she was risking losing her home because she couldn't get an ID, right? So there's a broad range of reasons that people need an ID. But if, like me, when I started this work, I didn't know this was a thing. I grew up with the kind of privilege that my mom had a lockbox somewhere with every document from my whole life in a nice little file. And so when it was time for me to get my driver's permit, right? My parents had cars, they could take me to get it, right? It was not an obstacle for me. But when you take away all of that, when you take away those kinds of privilege, then we're left with a perhaps more accurate reality that 26 million American adults, that's nearly 11% of our population, of the whole country, don't have a valid ID. And for most of those people, it's almost impossible to get. And we'll get into some of those reasons why. So when I think about who else, like who are those 26 million? Those are also, right, there's intersections in the data, right? A ton of intersections with people who were formerly incarcerated, people who have been removed from the voter registration polls or never registered to vote, people who are living below the federal poverty line, right? Those, you just can add the layers to it, right? To really get a picture of who this is impacting, because it's not impacting people that grew up looking like me, right? I think that's why this has become such a hidden crisis in the United States. People don't know that this is so hard unless you find yourself in one of these catch-22s and one of these difficult moments where the majority of people that we serve are finding themselves in. And that's why it's so important to figure out how to overcome those barriers, to know what they are and figure out how to overcome them. The barriers, the reasons people can't get an ID, there was a great study produced by the Movement Advancement Project in 2023 that outlines these 5 systemic barriers to ID access. And I think it's really a helpful way to look at it. So the first one being burdensome documentation requirements. Especially now, if any of you have been going through the Real ID transition in Missouri, 20 some odd years after we passed the Real ID law. But finally, we're going through it all. It's really challenging to figure out where to access the information about what documents you might need, let alone access the documents that you're going to need to get there, right? So there's kind of 2 layers to that, right? Is how to access the information, understanding and engaging that information, but then also getting the things that are in that list, right? Those are also closely related to number 4, this confusing patchwork of policies, because they are not the same everywhere. It's not the same in Missouri as it is in Illinois or in Kansas. It's not the same of where you get your birth certificate or how you get your birth certificate, which you probably need in order to get your ID. And so navigating then a whole system, not only of ID policies, but also of birth certificate policies. Let's add in there social security card policies, where to get it, how to get it, what you need in order to get it. Those 2 get really complicated really fast. There's also the issue of the financial cost of getting an ID. Now, I break this down a little bit into primary and secondary costs, because for some of us, $18 for a 6-year non-driver Missouri ID doesn't seem like a lot. I think I'm going to make some assumptions that this group is a group that would know that $18 can in fact be a lot of money for families that have significantly less, right? And let me add to that, right, that the cost of the document itself, as you already know, is not the only cost involved, right? So how many times do you have to take off work and go to the DMV? How many times is it going to take you at the DMV to get the documents after you wait in line and get up there and realize you don't have everything and then you have to go start over? How much money does it cost? Do you get transportation to the DMV because you have to go in person? So do you have to get a bus, a taxi, an Uber? Do you have to borrow? Do you have to give someone gas money? What about whether or not you can take off your job during the hours that the DMV is open? And what happens if you have to take personal time or unpaid leave, right? What happens when you also have to get your Kentucky birth certificate and in order to get your Missouri ID, and then to get your Kentucky birth certificate, you need these 6 other things. And so in order to get those 6 things, what do you pay to do that, right? So also we have seen so many mothers come in to our clinics with children, many children. My son is 10 years old, and taking him to the DMV is one of my least favorite things to do. It's boring for everyone involved. And sometimes then you got to figure out who's going to take care of your kids so you can go to the DMV and get your document while maybe keeping some of your sanity, right? So like some of that, it all goes in. So when I think about the cost of the ID, it's much more than the sort of upfront cost of the document itself. We could also talk about limited availability of ID services. I don't know if you saw, there was an article recently that now, I don't know, I think like 6 or 7 counties in Missouri no longer have motor vehicle offices there. They just like aren't in the whole county. So you have to like drive sometimes hours, probably 3 hours to get to the closest DMV office. That's a very different transportation and availability burden than what we see in the city. I, had to talk through some state officials in a trial a couple years ago to explain what the transportation burden looks like in St. Louis, where there's 2 license offices, now 3, in the city of St. Louis, and how many transfers and how long it takes on the bus to get there, right? Let alone if you live in St. Charles, where there is no public transportation, or Joplin, where there's no public transportation and people still have the same need to get these documents. There's also like hours and locations. We've talked about that. There are some license offices that have done, I would say, better to make hours available beyond the like 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, where people are often working, but adding evening hours or weekend hours. But is it enough, right? Like, I think also physical accessibility has been an issue and an increasing concern. Speaking, just really personally, I live in South City. The Kings Highway license office is the closest one to me. It's on South Kings Highway. And during COVID, they removed the chairs in the waiting line. Like as you wait in line, you could sit down. They removed those chairs and we had the 6 feet dots, on the floor. They never brought them back in. There are no chairs in there, right? So theoretically, they're meeting, some would argue they are in fact not meeting ADA standards and obligations, but like theoretically, the building is accessible. It's all blah, blah, blah. But I've watched a man walk in bringing his own folding chair so that he could sit down while he waited in line, right? So I think the accessibility is not just, again, the physical space, but also there's a member in our coalition that talked about, well, if you're taking the bus to get there, have the sidewalks been made available? And what if made accessible? And how many times you're going to whack your head on a branch if you can't see because the branch is above the sidewalk's head, right? Like the layers there just become more increased when you think about underlying sort of discrepancies and social inequalities. Finally, I think we could talk about discrimination. I know this happens at an individual level, and that is awful as it is. And we also know that it happens at a systemic level, right? We know that I've been working with this gentleman who we are now in our 2.5. So I guess that makes almost our 3rd year of working with him to get an Arkansas birth certificate. He's a Black man born in Arkansas in the 50s, and his birth was never recorded. And then the Catholic grade school that he attended changed his name because they said he couldn't have a name that was an abbreviation. It was like TL, right? And they were like, well, no, your name's now Tyler. And so at some point in his life, he could get an ID, a social security card, because he didn't need things. But now those laws have changed. He can't get his real ID unless he can show his certified birth certificate, which literally doesn't exist. So the layers of sort of systemic discrimination in there that, whether or not a birth was recorded to a Black man in the South in the 50s or before, like has nothing to do with how he gets an ID today, but impacts his ability to do so, if that makes sense. We've also seen that those 5 systemic barriers mirrored locally, right? So again, the barriers that people in Missouri are expressing is number one, cost. Almost 90% of the people say that we serve say that cost is a barrier to identification. The required documents is sort of the next level, right? That trying to get the underlying documents that you need for the ID is the barrier, and the 3rd highest is transportation, right? So when we look at, there are other barriers here, but when when I'm thinking about those 5 systemic barriers, they map on pretty darn close to what we're seeing here in Missouri. I mentioned this briefly. This is our local survey data to back it up, that the cycles that would be interrupted by having an ID are perpetuated when you don't, right? So things like not getting a job, not cashing checks, that's a big one for folks to, you know, how do you break these cycles, right? How do you get housing, get food? But you have to have an income. How do you get a job? And then when you get an income, how do you break it, right? So you can see it doesn't take much to like think through how that cycle perpetuates, but it's definitely what we see here in Missouri as well. I spoke briefly about House Bill 1878. I used to have a lot more context in here about it, but now we're moving a little bit further away from that. 1878 was one of the most the worst voter restriction legislation in the nation. I mean, Missouri's always kind of been high up there in our ability to restrict votes. This one made it even more so. It was not the first time that we became or that we required an ID to vote, but 1878, among a million other things, restricted the kinds of IDs that are acceptable in order to vote. I know we've got a handful of League of Women Voters folks on here and civic engagement folks on here, so you know those details too, and we know that we can't just disguise poll tax as an ID and pretend that it's not a poll tax. So I think that 1878 was sort of an eye-opening moment for a lot of Missourians who didn't realize that there were so many barriers to an ID, but now saw it because, oh, well, now people aren't going to be able to vote because they need an ID. And then there was sort of the rest of us saying, yes, but also sometimes you can't even get so far to think about voting when you are trying to figure out how to feed your kids or put a roof over your head, you know? Question in the chat here. No problem, Jan. Just as I mentioned real quick, it's being recorded. So you'll, give me a day or two, and then you'll have access to the recording. So you can hop in if you missed anything. Question regarding the St. Charles residents, on surveying St. Charles residents on barriers. Short answer is if residents of St. Charles have attended one of the existing clinics in this state, they likely have been surveyed and are included in this. I haven't sort of pulled apart the data by like region or city yet, mostly because people inconsistently fill out some like of the demographic information of like, you know, which zip code, and we have a handful of questions like that to be able to make those kinds of connections. But I can certainly look at that, although I hope doing this pilot project that will help us even get a better understanding of that kind of the kind of both need and barriers unique to St. Charles or specific to St. Charles. In Missouri, so in addition to 1878, and we could talk about that trial, but I'll get on a soapbox about it because basically, suffice to say that people in power in Missouri who are making decisions about photo identification have demonstrated a consistent lack of basic fundamental understanding of the lived reality of most Missourians, right? Go back to the thing I mentioned. I grew up in a household, my parents worked, it was stable household, it was my parents had cars, right? Like blah, blah, blah. Some folks find it really hard to imagine anything outside of their own experience, right? And that is, I think, part of what feeds into the systems that we're in right now, or situation that we're in right now, where there are so many people that don't have that kind of experience and are then excluded from systems that are designed for that, right? So if you didn't have that and the system is built for that, where does that leave you? In Missouri, we also have had a program since, I want to say Don, you might know this better than me, 2017, I think is when Show It to Vote first started. When we became a photo ID to vote state, the state also implemented a program that the state would say, okay, you're right, we can't charge you to vote. So we have to make an ID free to you if we're saying that the ID is what you need in order to vote, right? That program, which is now called Go Vote Missouri, I think we'll talk about it in a little bit. It exists. It's important for you to know that it exists. It has been haphazardly implemented across the state. It is inconsistent at best. And for a handful of reasons that we'll get into throughout the afternoon today, doesn't address the problems, right? If free IDs were like easy to get and that overcomes one of the barriers, right? If we go back a couple slides, but then there's the rest of the barriers. And so even if it was working at its best, we would still have some barriers to overcome to access IDs. And it is not working anywhere close to meeting the needs of Missourians in order to get an ID. There are also, not surprisingly, some population specific barriers. So we can get into these maybe if we have time or in Q&A, but if you think about communities or parts of our community that are already experiencing inequity or disenfranchisement or discrimination, those barriers are exacerbated when you're in the photo ID space, right? So for many immigrant residents in Missouri, getting a photo ID is not an option. If you are an asylum seeker and you have filed an asylum application or not, or you're in that sort of process, even if we think about the sort of easy cases within these like populations, there's sometimes not a solution. Similarly, transgender and non-binary Missourians face significant hurdles right now due to a recent change from last fall, where the state took away the process that had existed for a handful of years to have your gender marker on your photo ID match your gender identity. That has now become insurmountable for many transgender non-binary Missourians. And then housing. The unhoused Missourians face significant barriers proving that they are residents of Missouri, which is a requirement in order to get a Missouri ID. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but the barriers are real. So what do we do, right? I'm not going to just like sign out and leave you with, this is really hard and awful, so have a great day. Because now we switch and say, okay, but for real, what are we going to do about this? So ASHRAE approaches this with a two-prong approach. The first is we fight like hell to make the system work for people who need it right now. As it is, people have to get an ID in order to get what they need to live healthy and happy lives, hopefully. And the second prong is fight to change those systems, because it doesn't matter how many grants I write or volunteers or programs we make across the state, we won't be able to get everyone. We won't be able to reach everyone or meet the need so long as the systems are designed to discriminate and exclude people. So when going back to that survey, when we asked folks, what would you like to see? What would make a difference? One of the primary reasons was, the number one there is make a free ID, which is interesting because you're like, but Sarah, didn't you say that Missouri has a free ID program? I did say that. So we're going to come back to that. The second largest stack there, I know this is pretty hard to see on Zoom, but the second largest one there is fewer documentation requirements. And then we get into things like this second one here, reduced cost ID. Okay. So those kind of go hand in hand. Then we're getting into an online ID application, more access to services without a photo ID, right? So think about that, because it didn't used to be that you needed an ID to access a whole multitude of things, right? You could just access them. And now I would say largely post 9/11, we could go before that, but largely since 9/11, we have increased the demand to like the need to have an ID. We've increased the places that you need an ID to access basic services. And we've also made it harder and more complicated and burdensome to get that ID. So once again, we're perpetuating some pretty harmful cycles here. So in response to that emerges a series of activities all across the country. And in Missouri, specifically, we're talking about these photo ID programs. So sometimes I call them clinics. Language is flexible here, but the St. Francis Xavier College Church, which is on the campus of St. Louis University, it runs the longest standing ID and birth certificate program in the state. They started in the 90s, so it's looked different over time, obviously, and it has not been run by the same person. Christine would like me to tell you that. Um, but they have been doing this the longest. And when Ashray came into this space, we partnered with College Church from the beginning and said, like, what do you need? Do you need more volunteers? And basically the idea was they were saying, we do it on Tuesdays and we have funding limits and we have capacity limits. We need more people to do it. We have all the stuff like materials. Can you train people and run another program? And I was like, so just like take your stuff and copy it. And they were like, yes, right. So that's where we are. 3 years later, we've trained over almost 200 volunteers. We now run this weekly clinic on Thursdays. And we are part of the Missouri ID Access Coalition, again, getting into that advocacy space. So let's get into what these clinics look like. And I'm going to focus on our clinic, although I will caveat and say that a lot of what College Church and Ashray do are pretty parallel. We work really closely together. We have great collaboration. We learn from each other as we go. And I'm like, oh, why do you do that? Even the binder, I just reorganized our binders earlier this year because I was like, oh, you do it this way. And then, the volunteers were like, wow, this is so great. I was like, okay, well, it made sense, 3 years ago, but now we changed. So, College Church runs a bigger program than we do. So they usually have 10 to 15 volunteers at a time working with community members. So they serve about 70 people a week. Lately, it's been 60 to 70 people a week. And certainly spend well over $50,000 in financial assistance. So not taking into like program management and overhead and like staff fees, but just in the cash that goes out the door to help community members get their documents. It's expensive, right? So we, as I mentioned in 2022, took that to try to fill to meet this need, or fill a gap that was in the community where College Church couldn't serve everyone, couldn't fundraise enough, and was also thinking about like, this is a parish outreach program, right? Not like a whole other thing. So like, how do you hold that as a congregation in terms of like, we're trying to do congregation things and like now you're running like a statewide coalition, like what about? So Hugh Ashray, and so we, based on their model, what is that model? The model provides logistical assistance and financial assistance. So the first piece is the logistical assistance, where volunteers work one-to-one with guests to ensure that they understand the process, they understand the requirements, we navigate how to get those documents. Sometimes we have to get pretty creative to overcome the obstacles that we inevitably encounter there. We can provide some additional assistance for guests experiencing homelessness so that they can establish Missouri residency. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And when they walk out of our clinic, they leave with a packet that has really clear next steps for getting the documents, for where they need to go next, and how they need to get there and what to take and show when they get there. We also provide financial assistance. So that usually means that we screen for eligibility for the free ID, the Go Vote Missouri program. And then we cover the cost of a birth certificate from anywhere in the United States and one photo ID per person per year. I will say we have flexed on the one per person per year, especially lately, given all of the storms, because there are sort of extenuating circumstances here. Usually I say, that's how I try to budget for our program, but I think I have maybe once in 3 years told someone that we couldn't pay for his ID again because we had already done it twice in 1 year. So other than that, we're pretty flexible. I don't like to say no, for better or for worse. And then we also provide bus fares. So folks, the whole idea behind this, right, is that people come to us first so that by the time they go to the DMV, they can be successful. I don't work for the government, so I can't issue the ID. I can't print out a birth certificate. I can't do those things. But what I can do is make sure that the individual who has the need understands the whole system that they're supposed to navigate, and then can access it and have funding provided for them so that they don't have to make those tough choices about what to pay for if they can. I think the other piece that's really important in our program is really focusing on the relationship and the like community vibe, if you will. Some people call that dignity, some people call it humanity, goodness, kindness, whatever. It is important to me that when people come to our program, they feel loved at its core. They feel not judged, they feel respected, and it doesn't matter what they're like when they come in or which moment in their life they might be in. They should be greeted with care and compassion. And usually in our program, we have a small hospitality room. So we have food, like snack food and coffee and water. Sometimes we have folks that have donated hygiene kits. I have one woman that knits furiously. And so during the winter months, we have a usually ongoing supply of, hand knit hats and things like that. So I really think it's important that while there is a certain degree of transactionality, right? Like there's a process and people come in and we go through the things and that exists, but that we navigate that from a place of mutual respect. And I think that feels really important to how we do the work. So pause there for a second. Questions to this point, because we're about to dig into what is that work? What are the documents? What's the nitty gritty? I'm going to take a moment here and see if you have questions. Hey, Kristen. Bryn, coming off mute there? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate that the humanity that is built into this for treating people as guests and showing them that they are loved and cared for. Things are so procedural sometimes that gets lost. So I was delighted to hear that, and that really lifted my spirits, and I wanted to let you know that.
Thank you. I think, it's not something that is necessarily like, here's the slide, let me teach you how to do that. I'm going to trust that you're showing up to this because you know how to do that and you want to do that. And some days are hard and some people are frustrating, and that happens in our own homes with the people closest to us anyway, right? So I think just really, I think it's maybe safe to say that many of us have had a less than pleasant experience at the DMV in our lifetime. And that's not to throw shade on the DMV. It's really just to say, like, I know the system that we're operating in, and that doesn't feel good. And even when it's designed, like, literally for me, right? And so I think I want to flip that on its head in this space. And we do see people that are really struggling, and that's okay. And they should be able to walk into a space where we have access to information and resources that they don't, and not feel anything other than equally loved when they're there. And so that's something that we've tried to build into sort of the process. You'll see a little bit more, when we start with the binders. One of the first pieces is the community agreement form that is designed to help sort of set that tone from the beginning, that says, we are going to treat you in this way. We know you're going to treat us in that way. Here's what we can provide. Here's what you're going to provide, right? Because it does take, it is transactional, and it can be different than cold transactions. Yeah. Kristen, anything you want to share about that since you've been a volunteer in those spaces before? All right, we'll come back to you. You chime in later. And we'll keep going. Thank you for naming that, Bryn. Okay, so again, disclaimer, you don't have to remember everything. This part gets way easier the more you do it. So this might feel overwhelming, and that's okay. You'll have it all in the binder. You will not be alone until you are ready. And even when you're alone, you're in a space of lots of volunteers and staff that are doing this with you. Kristen, are you off?
I am. I'm so sorry.
That's
have a hard time with this. I would say the other piece of treating the guests in such a way is just that it also is reflected in the way the volunteers treat each other. It's a very pleasant place to be.
Thank you. So we're going to start with Missouri birth certificates. Why? Because as you'll see when we get to photo IDs, usually the first step for a photo ID, unless you're in some special circumstances, is that you need to prove your identity and your lawful status. And the most common document for that is your certified US birth certificate. Not the only one, but it's the most common one. So let's start with Missouri. There's basically it's sort of 3 steps. You need to prove your identity, you need to fill out the application, and then you got to pay for it, and they give it to you on the spot. Okay. So then we're going to break that down a little bit. How do you prove identity? Well, you have to show an ID. Well, guess what? If you need the birth certificate to get to the ID, and then you need an ID for the birth certificate, welcome to our first of several catch-22s. Fortunately, in Missouri, that is not an impossible cycle to break. Most of the vital records offices in our region will allow 2 documents with the applicant's name on it. They'll also accept multiple kinds of photo IDs, a student ID, a work ID, an expired ID, an out-of-state ID. They're pretty flexible with what kind of documents they'll receive. If not, then there are things that we get, if they don't have photo ID, then sometimes we have to get a little creative. Sometimes they have mail, sometimes they don't. Sometimes we can look things up online, print a phone statement or a Zelle app payment statement, things like that. The application is pretty simple. So it is usually there's a specific form for the vital records office that you're going to. There's also a form for when you apply to the state. Sometimes the application in Missouri, it only has to be notarized if you're mailing it in. If you're going in person, it doesn't need to be notarized. And then the cost of a Missouri birth certificate is $15. If you're mailing it in, you either have to add on whatever extra amount for the postage or include a self-addressed stamp return envelope. So, not the most burdensome and not the most expensive in terms of a nationwide perspective. Couple other details. The St. Charles County Vital Records Office is on Boonslick Road in St. Charles. I think maybe some nods of where that is. Great. So we'll come back to that. But the majority of birth certificates of people that we serve, people prefer to go in person because they can get it on the spot. So in Missouri, it's helpful to note that you can go to any vital records office in the state to get your Missouri birth certificate. You do not have to go to the county in which you were born. That's not the same for other states. So other states, that is the issue. That is in fact the case for Missouri marriage licenses, but not for birth certificates. So if I was born in Springfield, I can walk into St. Louis City Hall and get my Missouri birth certificate. So that's helpful. But not everyone is entitled to obtain someone else's Missouri birth certificate. Some states, they're much more open access. If you know the information, anyone can get it. In Missouri, you have to be an immediate family member. So that's usually parents, siblings, and grandparents. It also means that in the parents, there should be an asterisk like the parents named on the birth certificate. So if dad was not listed on the birth certificate, he has to provide something else in order to prove paternity and get the birth certificate. You can also do like authorized representatives. So a lot of times those are like attorneys or other authorized agents. Sometimes those are hospital personnel or staff. Sometimes like funeral staff, those kinds of folks that have some sort of access to obtain those records. A guardian, a legal guardian, foster parents or step parents can also obtain, but usually they will need one other piece of documentation to prove that relationship in order to get it. In Missouri, if you are an unaccompanied minor, then you can get your birth certificate for free from Missouri. So we don't see this too often, but I think it's helpful to mention so you can store it in the back somewhere And if a minor comes in and is in this situation, a minor who doesn't have their family or is considered unaccompanied, right? So no legal parent or guardian supporting them, and is under 21, then they can get this birth certificate for free. There's a separate form where they have to testify to be homeless or unaccompanied, and those are using constitutional definitions. The primary one, and you'll hear me say this again later, is someone lacking in fixed, regular, or adequate nighttime residence, right? So that's a pretty broad, you could understand that to mean couch surfing, staying with a friend, sometimes here, sometimes there, in my couch, in my car, at a hotel, like those sorts of things would all qualify under that. And if you fill that out, then you can get verified by a homeless service provider, and that will waive the fee for your Missouri birth certificate. There are some similar programs in other states. Not all states have them for minors. Some have a specific application for birth certificates that are for unhoused guests, and there's some like other waivers and types of stuff in other states, but this is pretty standard in Missouri. Although I would say people that we serve, I've maybe done this twice since we started our program. There are a handful of other issues that might come up, like how do I fix my birth certificate? They typed my name Sarah with an H, but it's really Sarah with no H. How do you go through that? There's a separate form, there's a whole other process. So some of that is still something we can address within the confines like of our clinic program. Some things get much more complicated. So if it is an amendment or not a typographical error, like they put some dad's last name and it wasn't the dad, or I don't know, making things up, right? But like if it's more complicated than like a clerical error, then it needs a court order, which means you have to file a petition, do all sorts of things, and it gets much more complicated. Similarly, for legal name changes or gender marker changes, that also now requires a judge's order, which means you file petitions, you have to pay costs for gender marker. It gets exorbitantly more complicated of where you have to post and announce and share and all kinds of stuff. There is theoretically a free Missouri birth certificate if you are getting your free ID for voting from the state of Missouri. This is challenging to obtain. There's one employee at the Secretary of State's office that manages the free ID to vote program. You can call or email her, and she will call or email you back and send you the form that then you send back to her, that then she sends in, and then they'll mail you the birth certificate theoretically. You can also sometimes go straight to the Department of Health and Senior Services and say that you're getting it for this purpose, but it's not very clear as to how that works. So in our program, even if they're getting their free ID, we just pay for the birth certificate so that they know that maybe they would be able to preserve the right to that in the future. The challenge is if we say, you can get it, and then they go, and the place where they go, or the clerk that they see when they go, has no idea what we're talking about, we're the ones that look bad, not them. And the person who pays the cost is the individual most in need, who now has to go back and forth and is being told one thing and a different thing, and we're back into these barriers, right? So it's more important to me that we prioritize the guest and what the guest needs, and if they need their birth certificate, then we're just going to get them their birth certificate. Side note is that in the city of St. Louis, this year we started piloting a program where we had this conversation with the Recorder of Deeds, who coincidentally was in the Missouri legislature when the Go Vote Missouri program was started. And he said, well, we're obviously supposed to be doing this. I feel a moral obligation to make sure that people get their free Missouri birth certificates. So now we have a stamp that we put on our on Missouri birth certificate applications, and people that go to City Hall that are getting their free ID to vote submit their birth certificate application with the stamp on it and then don't pay the fee. So it's been working great, but that's been a case by case, and it's only piloted so far with Ashray and College Church, which is also frustrating, but one step in the right direction. So that was all Missouri. I think I said when you go in to the vital records, you pay and then you wait, and then they print out your certified copy right there. So you walk out the door with it. Usually, depending on the line, it takes, 15 minutes or more if there's a lot of people waiting.
Can I jump in on that?
Please do.
I just wanted to say that Linda and I did meet with the Vital Records Department. They were very welcoming, very accommodating. They are very glad that we're doing this program. So I do not anticipate any problems in that department. The woman said, and this is, of course, she's a little biased, but she said they do get lots of people coming from some of the other surrounding counties because they're so nice. So that's a good plus.
We've also learned from partners in more rural Missouri that taking cookies every once in a while to the Vital Records office goes a long way for building healthy, mutual working relationships. So we'll get to that sometime during this pilot, certainly as a thank you when we're done piloting. But it's good. It's good to be. We are working towards the same goals, right? And so it's good when we can establish those kinds of relationships that help us do that. Okay, out-of-state birth certificates. You ready? Because I'm not going to teach you all of them because they're all different and they're all complicated. So this is going to be really high level, just so you kind of think about the general process. I'll say when we're in a clinic and someone's like, well, they were born in, pick a state, you go to the staff person and you kind of say, I need this state. My first question is going to be what city and county? So we'll start there. Then we pull the application, then we work through it and blah, blah, blah. So we're not going to go through all of that, but I'll give you the general, hopefully, a general overview of what it looks like, right? So we start, as I just mentioned, as local as you can. So oftentimes there are different application requirements or processes based on which level of government effectively you're at. So if you're at the city or the county or the state, there are different application forms. Sometimes there are different, more restrictive, less restrictive, more flexible, less flexible documentation requirements at that. It varies state by state. So some states, it doesn't, like Texas, you have to only go through the state. You can't go any more local than that. And they are notoriously rigid. That's a good word. Rigid in their acceptance of applications. So if you cross something out, or if there's whiteout, or if you did it wrong, they just send it back. They are also very picky about the documentation, not flexible about that sort of thing. And other states are sort of like, sure, this is great. Like, yeah, just sign on the side. That's fine. So it varies a lot. But we start as local as we can to find the application. We'll go through the application first to confirm the eligibility and review the required documents. So if we hit a barrier there, so the eligibility, right, is like, can you apply for your own birth certificate? Is it a mom applying for their kid? That sort of thing. Usually, majority of people we see are people applying for their own birth certificates, right? The required documentation is where we usually hit a roadblock. So we'll have to figure out, all of them say you need a photo ID. Great. And then you have to go to the exceptions. Well, if you don't have that, here's this whole list. Texas goes either 1 from list A and 2 from list B, or 1 from list B and 2 from list C. Like, it's excessive. Some are flexible, some are not, some are more complicated, some are less. So you go through the required documentation. If you hit a barrier, then we'll pull the next application up. So if we started at the city, then we'll look at the county, see if we get around documentation required there, and then we'll go to the state. So we'll kind of walk through it. And usually at one of those points, we're pretty good at coming up with a workaround, right? You have to verify the notarization requirements. Some states you have to notarize, some states you don't. Usually I will say maybe all except one application that I've seen, you have to sign it. Sometimes the signature block is a little hidden. I think Mississippi, the signature block is like shaded out for some reason. And so it's very common to like miss over it, except once you miss it, then you're like, they're never going to miss it again, right? But it's a pain because then someone leaves and then you have to find them again and figure out like, can you sign this? Blah, blah. So check notarization, check the signature. We have to figure out if we, include an envelope or not. We go through all that, uh, and then and then mail it in. So usually, at the clinic, the original documents and application, all that sort of gets saved into put into a folder, and the guest leaves with a copy of the application that we're going to mail in. ASHRAE usually after the clinic time will go through and make and print and type all of the checks and bundle it all up and mail it. So you won't actually have to do that, but you'll get us to that point. Out of state birth certificates should always be reviewed by someone else when we're in the clinic space. So sometimes that's staff, sometimes that's another float volunteer or just someone else who's working to kind of have two eyes and make sure, since they're all different, like that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's there. There are a few sort of nuances, right? So sometimes we can't overcome the documentation barriers or requirements. If that's the case, we will look at applying online. And the online applications go through a system called VitalCheck. VitalCheck is a third-party processor. It serves most of the vital records in the country. There are a few governments that now have created their own online application portals. But those are sometimes tricky to find because there's obviously other third-party, not credited vendors that want to try to jump in the middle of things. So we would go through VitalCheck. Why? One, it is usually helpful for clients with or guests with limited documentation. So if we can't get over the documentation requirements, if we get online, you go through the whole thing, you pay, and then you get a message as to whether or not they can answer security questions like, which of the following vehicles have you ever been associated with? Have you had those kind of questions before? And if you can answer those questions properly, then your application will go through. But we don't know if you get to that point or if they say, great, now it's time to upload your documents, and then you're back where you started. So you don't get to that until you pay. We've been working, College Church and ASHRAE share a massive Google Doc with notes about every state. So hopefully we have a better sense now of when VitalCheck would help or not. So like if it helps and we get security questions, then someone types a message in there so that I can look up and be like, oh great, we did that in April. We can do it online. So we hope to do it that way. Otherwise, we just sort of abandon the application. VitalCheck keeps their $13 and the Vital Records Office will return their refund the fee of the birth certificate if it doesn't sort of get out of VitalCheck. Which brings me to my number one criticism of VitalCheck. It's about 3 times as expensive as mailing it in or going in person. So there's always a $13, $12.95 VitalCheck processing fee. There are sometimes additional postage, mailing, or shipping fees. Sometimes it varies, but I think there's one state that like you just pay $20 like for shipping because you have to. And then you pay the Vital Records fee. So sometimes it can get prohibitively expensive, which is why we can't do it for everyone that we serve. So the online application is usually the back pocket sort of go to if everything else fails. I think there was something here I was going to mention. Hold on one second. Processing time. Again, varies by state. Some are very quickly. We've had a few from like St. Clair County in Illinois that, you'll have by the end of the week on a good week. You'll also have some that are literally months. California was running about 3 or 4 months processing time for a while. New York has been the worst. I think we had 8 months last year for a New York birth certificate. So it is wildly varied and difficult to track. So we just try to mitigate those expectations with guests. And I think that's another one of those spaces where we are on the same team as you, because I don't think that's right either. And I'm not the one that has to deal with it, but at least I can sit in that space with you of like, that sucks because now you can't get your Missouri ID until you get your out of state birth certificate, which is now going to take however many weeks or months it's going to take. And some would say that ain't right. So, that is just another one of those things where like we are navigating the system together. I don't make the system. I don't agree with it 90% of the time, but then we can build that kind of relationship with the people that we're serving so that they understand that we agree that it shouldn't be like this. Okay. Kristen, anything else you want to add about out-of-state birth certificates? So let's say now we finally got through the birth certificate. Let's talk about photo ID. So, a photo ID generally, I say, has 5 points, right? Because then or 5 sort of steps, right? And that's what you're seeing here. This is a summary. The documents that are listed here are not comprehensive. There are lists that are in the binders of like other things that could serve, but this is trying to keep it the most basic for us to just sort of capture the process, right? The first 2 are identity and lawful status. If you were born in the United States, the same document serves for both, which is a certified copy of your US birth certificate. If you were not born in the United States, then it gets fundamentally more complicated. But let's pretend that you were. So you'll need your certified copy of your birth certificate. It can't be a Xerox copy. No one says Xerox anymore. I said that once and someone was like, a what? And I was like a zero like a copy machine copy. So it can't be that. It has to be the fancy one with the raised seal or the fancy printed paper. You also have to prove Missouri residency. So that's the third part. That is usually something like a utility bill, a voter registration card, a bank statement. It can't just be any piece of mail for a non-real ID. If you are in a real ID space, you need 2 forms of proof of residency. One of them can be a piece of mail, any old mail, but one of them has to be from this other list of types of proof of residency. Then you also need your social security card. So most commonly, you need the card itself. There are a couple of other documents like a W-2 or a 1099 or pay stub if it has the full name or full social on it. But again, I would say the majority of people we see who need an ID don't have a 1099 or W-2 because that's what they're trying to get to, right? If people have had a Missouri ID in the last 10 years, which means that their social security number has already been verified. So at some point in the last 10 years, they showed an acceptable document to prove their social security number. They can just recite their social. So they won't need the actual card if it's been within 10 years. If it has not been within 10 years, it's safe to assume that the DMV does not have it verified, in which case they will need their social security card. We're going to come back to that because there's another catch-22 in getting the social security card, as you might imagine. Payment is $18 for a 6-year non-driver, non-real photo ID. We now have a new chart in our binders that navigate costs, because if you are upgrading to a real ID, they waive a process one of the fees, and so then you might pay $12 for a real non-driver. If you're getting a driver's license, then it's $27 unless you're upgrading and blah, blah, blah. So it gets more complicated, but generally it's $18 for the people, the IDs that folks we serve need. You could add a 6th document here if you've ever changed your name. So if your legal name does not match what's on your birth certificate, then you need something to prove it, which might mean your marriage license or your divorce decree, or a handful of any other things, court orders that change your name. But if your name is the same as your birth certificate, you don't need another thing. we can have a long conversation about real and non-real, but there are basically, this went into effect in May. There's no cost difference between the two, like you don't pay more for a real ID. There are cost differences based on where you are in renewing or replacing or upgrading or not. So it has now gotten messier, but we have a chart for that. But there are differences in the documentation requirements. So primarily that's around Missouri residency. And I think there, although I just had this clarified, the Social Security, up until 2 weeks ago when I talked to someone in Jeff City, we were under the impression that you had to show your Social Security card in order to get a real ID. If you've had a non-real ID in the last 10 years, meaning non-driver or driver or even a permit, and they've already verified your Social Security number, they are not requiring you to show it again. But if you, so you could just recite your number. But if you don't meet one of those requirements, then you have to have the card. Are church baptismal certificates accepted? The short answer is no. They can be helpful for getting some of the underlying documents. So like in order to get your birth certificate, a baptismal certificate could help overcome that need an ID to get it. That's also been helpful for out-of-state birth certificates. And we haven't talked about this, we don't need to get into it, but that could be helpful for getting a municipal ID, like the Gateway ID card in St. Louis that's hopefully launching by the end of the year, which then could be used as another way to overcome one of the other barriers. Okay, I talked about free ID to vote a lot. I'm going to say it again. Every Missouri resident who is eligible to vote is entitled to one free state ID for voting purposes. There is no such thing as a voter ID in Missouri. It is the same ID. It's a non-real, non-driver photo ID. That is what this is about. You don't get a separate one. It has no additional marking on it. It's the same ID. In order to get it, you have to be eligible to vote, which means you have to be 18 or older, and you cannot currently be on probation or parole. If you are off papers, you can do this. If you have a felony conviction that is not related to voting, which it literally never is, you can have this as long as you're no longer on probation or parole. But what it doesn't have in this list is that you have to prove or show that you are registered to vote. The Department of Revenue does not have or manage voter registration information, so they can't verify it. They can verify the eligibility for voting. So part of our screening at clinic, as always, we always have a question about, have you been, are you registered to vote? Can we update your status, or do you want to register? We encourage that. I've had some really rich conversations with people who like have never been asked or invited to vote before, which is very cool when it happens. I mean, it's not cool that it has not happened, but it is cool in those conversations, right? Of like, me, you want me to vote? But we don't force it, obviously. And so when you go, if you are in the free ID to vote sort of screening process through us, you just have to be eligible to register to vote, if that makes sense. If eligible, there's sort of two paths. We can send you to the license office to get your ID. It's the same documentation requirements, but you have to say the magic words when you get there, which is, I need my free ID to vote. It's the same ID, but you have to say it, that it's for voting purposes. We have a 2-page flyer that says that sort of we created because we asked Department of Revenue and Secretary of State's office for years to like give us a thing or post a thing about this, which they have not done. So we made our own, and it usually works. But there are times, depending on which DMV you go to, a handful of other reasons, that they will say you're not eligible, or they'll say we don't do that. Or what we've heard this year was, well, it's not an election year, so that's not a thing. And those are not true, right? But again, the problem is that's a fight that I can have, but the guest who's stuck in the middle of this thing doesn't have time for that kind of baloney and that kind of power play of like, well, but I can blah, blah, blah. So we do some screening. We like to tell folks, I make it a practice to tell everyone that it exists and when they can use it and how they can use it. And I'm happy to pay for it today. And you can save this for later should you need it at a time in the future. That is better for me because my goal is to have people get their darn IDs, not have people going back and forth between a system that doesn't actually care if they get it or not. We've talked about some of the challenges and inconsistencies. Those continue. Last year, we saw some pretty good improvement because we were pushing really hard to identify the patterns and the inconsistencies and what people were saying, and constantly telling DOR and Jeff City to like go get your people. Please make sure they know how to do this. So it improved from where it was 2 years ago. But again, now we're sort of seeing it again as it comes up. Kristen?
I visited the DMV off of Old 94 and the one in O'Fallon. I think that's the only two in St. Charles County. And at the one off of 94, the person I was talking to, when I asked her if they very often get anybody asking for their free ID so they can vote, she said, "Oh, we don't do that." But the person sitting next to her in the office area said, "Oh, yeah, we do," and did know about it. So she said, "Well, I'm not fully trained on that part." So hopefully, there's somebody in the office that knows that if we arm the guest with the flyer and tell them it's true, ask them to, send it to the manager or whatever if they get denied, hopefully we'll be able to overcome that variable.
I think, thanks for saying that, because I think it is twofold, right? Like we have to do our work with the DMVs, even though I believe that is not our work to do. We will do that work to make sure that they know that it is happening and blah, blah, blah. And part of the like screening is sort of just like trusting your gut when you're working with someone. I think it's pretty clear, like when someone is like, hell yeah, I'm going to do that, right? Or like has the like, this is my right and I'm going to, and then you're like, yeah, I'm all in. And sometimes people are just like, get me out of here. I am so stressed and overwhelmed. I just need to get my stuff. Then I just give the check, right? Like we don't need to, at the end of the day, it's $18 for ASHRAE. So I am more than happy to keep writing grants to fund this program and pay $18 than to put someone in the middle of a battle that really isn't theirs. Okay, one of the last couple of pieces here, we're going to wrap up soon. The Certificate of Homeless Status and Residency is a big form that we use. This came out of 3 years of advocacy that College Church led through the coalition. It's sort of how the coalition formed and came to be. This is an exception process, so you won't see it on the list of acceptable documents for Missouri residency. It is only good for non-real, non-driver IDs. So you can't use it for a driver's license and you can't use it for a real ID. That's an ongoing conversation, so we'll come back to that as I get more info from DOR. But currently, it's just for non-real, non-driver. This basically means that anyone who meets the statutory definition of homeless, which again is lacking in fixed, regular, or adequate nighttime residence, I'll say, you're welcome to pull up that statute. There's about 13 different bullet points. This is the one that feels easiest to sort of check of like, if you meet this, then you can probably use this form, right? So if an individual meets that, basically the form says, the individual signs and says, I attest that that's me. I am homeless under this definition. And then the homeless service provider, which is any nonprofit that serves a person who meets that definition, says, yep, they said that they meet that definition, and yep, I'm serving them. So therefore, they can use my organizational address to get their ID. Okay. So if someone is in that situation, we would receive their ID at ASHRAE's address, which is in the city. So we'll have a sort of secondary conversation around this with folks that are in St. Charles. Mostly, I think that's not been a reason where people are like, ooh, I don't want to have a 63107 zip code. That's not usually the concern. Most people who are in this situation need an ID in order to get out of their housing insecurity. So even if that ID has our address on it, they can keep that for 6, 6 years until it expires, or they can come back anytime that they can prove their residency, and I will gladly pay for a second ID so that they can change their address. So this form alone suffices for, if you remember the 5 things for Missouri photo ID, one of them is proof of Missouri residency. This form checks that box for non-real non-driver. ASHRAE staff signs it. So when you're at clinic, if it comes up, that's something that we'll fill out sort of together, but just know that it staff has to sign it at the end. We talked about Social Security card. I have been told that you can apply online and get it online. I've heard of one person that has been successful for. I have never found that to be successful for any program guest that we served. What I have heard most recently is also now, at least in St. Louis, you can't just walk in and wait in line. You have to make an appointment and then go. Sometimes making an appointment takes a long phone wait. I've even heard that you have to like wait literally for a couple hours on the phone to make an appointment to go in to get your thing. Now, what do you need? There's no cost, right? So our role at the clinic is provide information. So we have like a 2-pager that details out the requirements and rules and all sorts of stuff. But basically you have to prove 2 things to get your Social Security card: citizenship and identity. So Social Security office says, oh, you just need your birth certificate and your photo ID. So catch-22 number 30,000 or however many we're at, you need your ID to get your Social Security card, which you need in order to get your ID. So naturally there's a list of exception documents. It is pretty strict and rigid. I think the easiest workaround when truly someone can't get an ID without their Social Security card has been for them to see a medical service provider and then request copies of medical records with what the Social Security office describes as a wet signature. So that means you can't print it right from like your patient portal or whatever. You have to have the like certification. It could be a stamp signature from someone, but it has to be that. There are a couple of other things that could be explored, but that has been the one that we have used a couple of times. We have a couple of scenarios here. I'm going to skip through them, and I want to leave time for Q&A. So I'm going to wrap us up with, okay, I want to tell you a little bit about ASHRAE and what the next steps are, and then I'm going to hush up and we can chat and you can ask questions and we'll go from there. So ASHRAE, as I mentioned, we launched our first clinic in August of 2022. We've served over 3,300 people to date. We see majority men and majority people who identify as Black or African American. As I mentioned, 51% of our guests currently, although the percentage is a little bit higher when you look at just 2025 alone, but overall time, little over half of our guests are unhoused, and usually about a quarter of our guests use that form. A quarter of the unhoused guests use Form 5862 to get their ID. People who are unhoused but living in a shelter or in a transitional housing program can often get proof of residency, like a letter from the shelter. And so that's why you would see here that maybe 75% of the unhoused guests we serve are already in a program that can provide that housing residency documentation for them. As you can see between birth certificates and photo IDs, not everyone needs both. So we will see, I would imagine actually in St. Charles, we might see a similar spike or trend that we see in the fall in the city, which is mothers coming in to get their kids birth certificates so they can register or enroll them in school for the fall as like oh crap, I need this thing. So some folks come in just for that. Some folks come in for both. Some folks have their ID or have their birth certificate and just need the ID. So that's why it's not always a one-to-one or two-to-two. Some people need both. Some people need different ones. So we're happy to do all of that. I mentioned briefly about the coalition. So we were able to get a 3-year grant to support the coalition. We are now sort of the backbone organization for the coalition, the director. We have a full-time staff person of the coalition now who works at ASHRAE. We meet monthly on Zoom, and actually our next meeting is this Wednesday. So I'll pop the link in the chat, and if you're interested, you are welcome to join us. There is a direct programs working group within the committee that is within the coalition that are people throughout the state who are doing direct service ID assistance programs like you all, like us. So I'll be leading that working group this Wednesday. So I'll put the link in the chat. You're welcome to come and just be connected to all that is happening at the statewide level. Next steps. As I mentioned, the St. Charles Project is going to launch in August. So we will do August, September, and October, first and third Wednesdays, right? So we're going to start 2 times a month. Before that, we're asking all volunteers to be trained, so you can check that box, and to come shadow us in St. Louis. So the best piece is for you to come to St. Louis and sit in our Thursday program and work one-to-one with someone. That's what all of our volunteers do. If you know that there's no chance that you can make it to St. Louis on a Thursday, but you still really want to volunteer on one of the Wednesdays, talk to me. We'll make it work. The best way to learn is to come sit with someone. So folks generally shadow, I don't know, Kristen, I would say 2 or 3 times until they feel like, okay, I'm ready. And then they'll fly solo, which really just means not follow someone. You'll be independently working one-to-one in the big community that is our space. So there's a online link, which I'll pop in the chat here, and you'll also get it by email. Follow up of where to sign up for a shadow shift. And those are on Thursdays. So we have clinic this Thursday, and Thursdays in July. So if you can do that, I think, Kristen, I'll check when we open the signups for the St. Charles Clinic. I think we'll put a couple of shadow shifts there, or maybe we already did, so that people who can't shadow before then could shadow in St. Charles. But ideally, just come to St. Louis. I know it's across the river and all of that, but we can do it.
Well, and Linda and I go most Thursdays. And frankly, I learn something new every time. So for me, I like going. But if anybody wants a ride, let us know and you can ride with us. And then it makes it just a little less cumbersome to get to St. Louis.
Kristen, do you want to answer Bryn's question? Oh, sorry, Bryn, do you mean the St. Charles ones or the Thursday ones?
Actually both.
So the Thursday
That's printed somewhere, so I could plan to block off that time.
Yep. So the Thursday ones in the city are usually 10 to 2, but in July we've extended them. They're 10 to 4. Volunteer shifts are 2-hour blocks. So you could come for all of it, or you could come for just a shift,
Okay.
or any combination thereof. Kristen, do you want to talk about timing for St. Charles?
You're going to challenge my menu, but I want to say we're from 12 to 2 on those Wednesdays that we're going to be open.
That's correct. And
yeah.
when you get to the sign-in sheet, which I'll put in here in just a second, you'll see the shifts are a little bit like it's just one shift, but it's a little bit of buffer time at the beginning and the end so that we can meet as a team, make sure things are set up, and kind of regroup at the end of each day because this is a pilot. So it's just one shift, 10 to 2, I think, with 30 minutes on both sides.
For anybody that hasn't been exposed to this kind of volunteering, I will say that it is, you definitely get a lot out of it because it's so concrete. You actually do something that makes a difference in somebody's life. And the people that I have yet to serve anybody that just didn't really appreciate and felt cared for, which is a big part of the culture of the organization, of course. But it's also that somebody is just actually doing something for them without judgment and making sure that they have been well served. And I would say, from my personal experience, I'm sure there's statistics on this, but about half the people that I serve hear about us from other people versus from their case managers or from organizations. And so you know that the people that are coming are choosing to and are desperately trying to get out of the situation that they're in. And again, you just feel like, you know, you really did something for somebody that meant something and is a step in the direction that they needed to go.
And when you're shadowing, and then certainly in St. Charles during pilot, you'll kind of get a sense of the flow of the space. So usually we have like I call them application support stations, which is one-on-one with a volunteer and the guest, and sometimes a shadow volunteer too. And then that's where the binders are. That's where everything sort of happens. The guest can stay seated the whole time. The volunteer gets up to get a few things. So there's usually like a file box that has, oh, we need a verification letter, or we need to pick up the checks or whatever. You like get up and get that and come back to the table. But sort of the core spaces happens at the application support stations. There's usually a float volunteer that sort of is available to help troubleshoot. In St. Charles, it'll probably just be me for the first couple weeks to figure out, you know, how what it's like. Since it's pilot, you know, I'm asking folks to be flexible, that you could get there and we could see one person, and so maybe bring a book the first time, or we could get there and have, you know, 25 people waiting and just go all in until we get through. So we don't know what to expect when we've done offsite clinics. Let's see, I did one in a couple in like Sykeston and New Madrid, way down in the Blue Heel. And, you know, one time we saw 12 people and another time we saw 40. So it's a little bit of a learning curve. So if you're able to practice that flexibility, we'd love to have you. You will get a follow-up email from me or from Alana on my team that will have the links I put in the chat. So all volunteers are required to review and sign a confidentiality agreement. Goes through some pretty basic things. You're not going to take pictures. You're not going to take personal information, blah, blah, blah. And then the link to sign up for the shadow shift, and then the actual volunteer shifts in St. Charles are also linked on that one. And then I also included the link to the coalition meeting, so you're welcome to do that.
Is the binder available online to review prior to coming to the training?
Great question. I would say a version of it is available online. It's not the most current one. So let me see if I can pull it up real quick here. I realize we're at time, so if someone has to jump off, please don't wait for me to say thank you, goodbye. You may certainly go, but otherwise I'm gonna just pull up this binder real quickly.
And the binder really is your guide. I mean, it steps you through the steps so you don't have to worry about memorizing things. I mean, it really does walk you through what you're trying to get done and reminds you of what you need to do next. I've had two different people with two different opinions related to the paperwork. One of them said after she shadowed a shift, which makes it really a good idea to shadow, she said, you know, I just really don't like to do paperwork. And I don't think this is really the right thing for me. Another person who said going into it, I hate paperwork. This is my worst nightmare. And after she shadowed us, and I said, well, you know, just shadow once and you'll see really the paperwork is almost secondary. What is really the primary is the relationship that you have with the guest and the discussion and learning their story and helping them figure it out. It's so much more than the actual filling out of forms. And she agreed. She said, I'm coming back. This was good.
Thank you. I did drop a link to a page on the coalition website that has the joint version of the binder. I would say it's pretty general, and it's the way it's set up. You kind of have to imagine it as a binder. In our binders, right? There's like tabs and stuff. So I have thought about like what's the best way to make it look like an actual binder. I don't know how to do that yet. So it's there for now. If you want to look through it, you can see some of the flow charts.
I appreciate it. There's a couple of people here that know me. I'm just a wonky person. I like binders and procedural manuals and, you know, that doesn't excite a lot of people, but I think they're the best thing ever. So I just wanted to read it if I could.
If I could live in a spreadsheet with lots of colors, I would, but
Yeah, it's a
unfortunately, I
beautiful
can't put my whole life in a spreadsheet yet.
So thank you for offering that to me. I
Of
appreciate it.
course, of course. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you for spending time with me today, with us, with each other today. And you will get a follow-up email with some links and next steps. And I hope to see you either on Thursdays or if not, in St. Charles. Thanks, everyone.